Have you ever found yourself in a relationship where you want to label the person as toxic, but you're just not quite sure? You know that you don't always like how you feel around them. Maybe some of their actions have been downright hurtful, but you're still not sure if they truly qualify as toxic. Look, these days that word toxic gets thrown around almost as much as narcissist. And it's tempting to slap a label on someone whose behavior feels off. But before you rush to conclusions, stick with me. Because in this episode, we're diving into the unmistakable signs of a truly toxic person, how you discern whether it's them or you, and we're going to uncover the 7 surprising traits that may feel toxic, but actually aren't. Well, hey, my friend, in case we haven't met yet, my name is Kris Reece, and it is my hope to help you navigate difficult relationships and conquer codependency biblically. I also want to invite you to grab a copy of our free Narcissist Survival Guide. I will go ahead and include a link in the description section below. I want you to think about relationships like shoes. Some shoes are a perfect fit. They support and they comfort you no matter where you go, and you could walk in them all day without a second thought. Then there are those shoes that just don't fit. No matter how much you try to break them in, they pinch, they rub, and they leave you with blisters. And it's tempting to label these shoes as bad. But are they really? Or are they just wrong for your foot? Or maybe they're the wrong shoes for the wrong occasions. You know, like trying to wear stiletto heels for a day of walking in New York City. Look, the truth is some shoes are your go-to favorites. You reach for them instinctively because they always deliver, and others sit in the back of your closet. You like them in theory, and every so often you pull them out with a burst of optimism, only to quickly remember why they ended up back there in the first place. And then there are those shoes that are so uncomfortable you couldn't even imagine giving them away. They're that painful. And relationships are much the same. Sometimes it's not about labeling someone as bad or toxic, but about recognizing the fit. Are they the right fit for the journey you're on? Are they meant to walk alongside of you, or were they only ever meant for a season? And the same is true for traits that you might label as toxic. And sometimes what feels toxic is just a mismatch, like assertiveness clashing with your need for gentleness, or introversion seeming dismissive to someone who craves connection. Now, don't get me wrong. There are some shoes that are just truly broken, with the nails and staples sticking out and the soles all falling apart. And yes, there are genuinely toxic people too. But before you toss everything into that toxic pile, it's worth asking, is this person harmful by nature? Or are they just not the right fit for you? And understanding this difference can help you decide whether to walk away or adjust the way you step forward in the relationship. So before you go ditching a potentially decent relationship, or worse, breaking marital covenants, I want to start by identifying truly toxic traits. Look, there are just some traits that we can universally agree that are destructive. Much like those shoes. They might be pretty on the outside, but over the short time span, there is not a woman I could find that would say, yeah, those are comfortable. And it doesn't matter how pretty they look or how expensive they are, they're just not good for you. But there are traits that everyone can agree, I don't care how much of a glutton for punishment you are, that can actually be considered toxic. And if you are dealing with any of these, verbal abuse, manipulation, chronic lying, secrecy, selfishness, chronic negativity, dismissiveness, vindictiveness, disrespect, explosiveness, or exploitativeness. Is that a word? That's just to name a few. And if we can all agree that traits like these are undeniably toxic, I mean, even the Bible in 1 Timothy 3 tells us to avoid such people, then why do so many of us stay in these relationships? Why aren't we running when these behaviors are so clearly destructive? Could it be that we see something else in these individuals that make us question our perception? Now, I'm not talking about the clear manipulation of, romantic gestures mixed with abusive behaviors. I'm talking about behaviors that might seem toxic at first glance, but are tied to someone who at their core may not actually be toxic. Traits that wouldn't exist if they weren't driven by something deeper. Now, I can almost hear what you're thinking at this point. Oh, Kris, they know what they're doing. They know what they're doing is wrong. I am not giving them a pass. Look, I get it. I've been there. I used to think they don't deserve an excuse for their poor choices. But what if there's more to this dynamic than what's visible on the surface? You see, every person enters a relationship with a set of defaults, cultural behaviors, personality traits, past experiences, wounds, you name it. And what one person sees as toxic, another might see as normal or even admirable. Assertiveness might feel like confidence to one person, but like aggression to someone who's been bullied in their past. Sarcasm might be playful to someone, but feel like cruelty to others who've been mocked. Here's the truth. No one escapes this dynamic. And I promise you, there's at least one person in this world who thinks you're toxic. So before we label someone as toxic, we have to ask, what's really going on beneath the surface? Theirs and yours. So let's talk about your surface for a moment, the way you react, interpret, and label others. And often it reveals the unhealed areas of your life that God may be looking to address. And this brings us to the subjective nature of toxic. You see, what feels toxic to one person might not to another. Traits like sarcasm, introversion, ambition, or assertiveness aren't inherently toxic. And it actually depends on how we perceive them. For example, sarcasm might feel like playful banter to one person, but an emotional dagger to someone else. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not blaming you for their behavior or telling you that you just have to justify what they're doing. But just as they come to the relationship with cultural defaults, personality traits, past wounds, and experiences, so do you. And sometimes when their stuff collides with your stuff, it can feel like wearing a pair of mismatched, uncomfortable shoes. So why can one person thrive in a relationship with someone you find unbearable? It all comes down to fit. Relationships, like shoes, need to align with your unique sensitivities and experiences. And what feels supportive and comfortable to one person might be painful or mismatched for someone else. And sometimes what feels toxic isn't toxicity at all. It's miscommunication, personal triggers, or differing values. And this isn't about excusing bad behavior. It's about understanding the interplay of personalities and histories. By digging deeper, we can actually discern whether someone is truly toxic or just struggling in ways that maybe require clarity, compassion, and a little bit of boundaries. Here are a couple of helpful questions to ask yourself. Number one, does this behavior harm everyone or just me? Number two, am I seeing this through the lens of my pain and preferences? Now, let's say the traits are clearly harmful, but what if they aren't rooted in selfish, toxic narcissism, but rather something equally painful, but maybe even fixable? Understanding what's beneath the surface can make all the difference in how you approach the relationship. So we've covered the universally toxic traits, those destructive patterns that everyone agrees are harmful. And we've discussed the subjective traits, the ones that bother some but not others. But now let's revisit something a little bit trickier. Toxic traits that actually come from not necessarily toxic places. Now you're probably thinking, come on, Kris, isn't toxic just toxic? Well, yes and no. A behavior can actually feel toxic, but that doesn't mean that it stems from a genuinely toxic source. So does that make a difference? Well, it should. Think of it like looking into a funhouse mirror. It distorts the reflection, but the distortion isn't the truth of the person standing there. And the same is true for certain traits. They might mimic toxicity, but they often come from other issues. So let's dive into the 7 traits that mimic toxicity. Number 1 is attachment disorders. People with dismissive avoidant or fearful avoidant or even any insecure attachment style often exhibit a very confusing push-pull dynamic in their relationships. They crave connection, but they fear emotional vulnerability, and they really fear rejection. So the result? They end up pulling back just when the relationship gets closer. And the more you chase, the more they withdraw and the more angry they get. This can feel toxic. Now, I'm not saying that this is a healthy dynamic by any stretch, but it's often rooted in past wounds rather than an intent to harm. Number 2 is quirky habits. Some people are simply different. Maybe they have unusual habits, peculiar preferences, or some quirky ways of expressing themselves. And as much as we say we accept others as they are, it can be difficult to embrace these differences, especially in close relationships when these very quirks start to get annoying. Because over time, these quirks get very frustrating and it's easy to label them as toxic, when in reality, they're just different and maybe annoying. Number 3 is unresolved trauma. Unresolved trauma has a way of lying dormant until something triggers it. Then insecurities, anger, or fear can surface in a way that feels toxic. But this isn't about who the person is. It's about the unhealed wounds that they're carrying. And these behaviors are defense mechanisms, not deliberate attacks. I know they feel like deliberate attacks. And I know what you're already thinking, and I'm going to answer that question in just a moment, so just stick with me. Number 4 are addictions. Substance abuse or other addictions can create behaviors that mimic toxicity. They create the lying, the secrecy, the emotional outbursts, the defensiveness. And you're thinking, wait a minute. Didn't we just agree that these are universally toxic behaviors? And while these actions are undeniably harmful, they're often symptoms of a deeper issue, the addiction itself. And the person behind the addiction may not be toxic, but the behaviors driven by their struggle can certainly feel that way. And number 5 is emotional immaturity. This is a big one. Some people haven't developed the emotional skills needed for healthy relationships. They may have aged chronologically, but emotionally they're stuck at 5, 10, 12 years old. And they struggle to regulate their emotions, communicate effectively, and even empathize with others. And this immaturity can manifest in ways that feels selfish, manipulative, and even punitive. But it's often a sign of an underdeveloped emotional intelligence, not malicious intent. Number 6 is demonic influence. We cannot dismiss the spiritual side of this. Sometimes behaviors that seem toxic may actually be the result of spiritual warfare or demonic influence. There are demonic spirits assigned to destroy the life of your loved one, and if they can take you out too in the meantime, all the better. Now, I'm not saying that this is a "the devil made me do it" defense, but if there are open doors or extreme brokenness in a person's life, or if they're not fully submitted to the Lord, oh, my friend, this can be an opening for spirits of pride, perversion, lust, greed, apathy, anger, rebellion, division. I could go on. These are hard at work, affecting and infecting the life of your loved one. And while these demonic spirits are no match for our Lord, they are a force that is way too much for the life that isn't fully surrendered to the Lord. This does not excuse their actions, but it reminds us to approach these situations prayerfully, discerning the spiritual battle at work. Number 7 is other disorders. Mental health disorders like bipolar disorder, maybe there's an anxiety disorder, or something like codependency, not that that's a mental disorder, can actually produce behaviors that feel toxic. And these behaviors aren't about malicious intent, but rather the maladaptive coping mechanisms of trying to avoid or even navigate these types of conditions. So, why does this matter? When we understand the root of someone's behavior, we can respond with more clarity, wisdom, and compassion. This does not mean excusing harmful actions or tolerating mistreatment, but it does help us to discern when to draw firm boundaries and when to extend grace. Toxicity isn't always black and white. The difference between a truly toxic person and someone struggling with unresolved issues lies in their response to accountability. Someone striving to grow, however slow it may be, will show a willingness to want to change. But a toxic person thrives in denial, defensiveness, and blame shifting. An unhealed trauma might explain someone's behavior, but it is never an excuse. Because as the saying goes, once you know better, do better. And traits and behaviors left unchecked often spiral into full-blown toxicity. And the key difference is whether there's a desire to heal or a refusal to change. And here's where you need to be cautious. You can recognize someone's struggles without taking the responsibility for them. It is vital to bring this person to the Lord in prayer, asking for wisdom on how He might use you. But I need you to remember this, my friend. It is not your job to fix or save them. That is the work of Jesus. Now, this doesn't mean that abandoning your role as a spouse or a parent or a friend, but it does mean guarding your heart, setting boundaries that align with biblical truth. And ultimately, their response is not your responsibility. Your role is to stand firm in faith, maintain airtight boundaries, and protect your peace and honor God. If you have ever wondered just how much demonic influence plays into toxicity, I want to make sure that you check out this episode here for the undeniable signs that narcissists are controlled by demons. And if you struggle with wanting to fix people or assuming responsibility for the relationship more than you should, I want to invite you to check out my online course called Conquering Codependency Biblically. I will go ahead and include a link in the description section below.